Yes, we're live.
Okay, good morning. This is again February 11th. And Senate Natural Resources and Energy. And we are joined today by Jim Stuckey from the Joint Fiscal Office. Thank you for being here. Give us a fiscal note on this bill that we've been talking about on reducing chloride contamination. So I think we should probably do one quick round of introductions and then we'd love to hear what you have to say about the fiscal note. So,
Hi, welcome. I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from the Addison District.
we hopefully will be joined by Senator Terry Williams from Rutland. I'm Ann Watson from the Washington District.
Seth Bogarts from the Bennington Senate District. Yeah. Scott Beck from Caledonia.
And you, of course, know Jude. Okay, great, super.
Well, good morning, Chair Watson and committee members. For the record, my name is James Duffy. I'm a fiscal analyst with the Legislative Joint Fiscal Office. And I'm here today to provide testimony on S29, an act relating to establishing a chloride contamination reduction program at the Agency of Natural Resources. The Joint Fiscal Office has prepared a memo identifying the preliminary fiscal considerations pertaining to this bill. And we were asked by Chair Watson to appear before the committee to walk through some of those considerations today. This memo is not a fiscal note, but I expect that it closely resembles the eventual fiscal note that we will produce for this bill as it continues to move forward in this committee and potentially others. And so I'm happy to present the information and hear any questions from the committee members that you may have. Chair Watson, I'm happy to pause at any point as we go through the memo to take questions, but I'll defer to Chair whether you'd like to take questions at the end or throughout the walkthrough of the memo.
Yeah, we'll keep going for now, but if questions come up, we can
Great.
deal with them as they come.
Okay, so it should be up behind me for the benefit of the room. So in preparing this memo, you'll note that JFO has kind of broken up the cost considerations and the fiscal impacts into two broad categories. The first starts on page 1, and these are the direct fiscal impacts to the state. So this includes the $250,000 allocation for a third-party vendor, as well as other potential direct expenditures that would affect the state budget and the potential appropriations. And then on page 2, JFO provides some considerations for indirect fiscal impacts. These are fiscal impacts that may not be felt by the state budget itself, but could be felt by municipalities, private actors, et cetera, outside of state government. JFO does not typically provide detailed financial analysis for things like municipal budgets or things of that nature outside of the state budget, but we can certainly articulate some of the considerations involved for fiscal impacts outside of the state budget. So that being the kind of breakdown of the two cost categories and impact categories in the memo, I'll start running through them one by one in order. So the bill provides, as you know, an initial appropriation of $250,000 for a third-party contractor to assist with and potentially spearhead implementation and coordination of third-party certification program that's provided for in the bill as proposed, as written. And this is expected to be a base cost that will recur in future years as well. Beyond the allocation and appropriation for an outside third-party vendor, JFO has also identified potential additional agency staff hours that would need to be dedicated to implementation of the program within the Agency of Natural Resources. The amount of additional staff hours performed by ANR and other state employee staff would largely depend on the balance of work that's to be performed by the third-party contractor and the eventual scope of any contract that's entered into between ANR and that vendor. But that said, there are certain activities that we can anticipate in the bill that would need to be performed by state employees and not an outside vendor. Examples of that would include any rulemaking activities that would accompany this program, as well as potential enforcement and contracting activities that would happen within state government. And so to the extent that those happen within ANR, those additional staff hours would represent an additional cost to the state beyond the $250,000 appropriation for the outside vendor. There's also mention in the bill of a requirement to cover all state-owned salt and sand storage facilities by 2030 or 2035, depending on those facilities' proximities to waters of the state. To the extent that there are uncovered salt and sand storage facilities owned by the state, covering those would represent additional direct fiscal impact. I believe the community's just received a memo from the Agency of Transportation, either early this week or late last, stating that 100% of state-owned salt storage facilities are already covered, or at least V-Trans's salt storage facilities are already covered, and that there are 9 sand storage facilities, of which one of those 9 is mixed with salts as well for moisture control within the sand pile. So I think the number of potential state-owned facilities that would need to be covered would appear to be maximum of 9 and potentially as few as 1, depending on what the eventual bill requires, if sand only storage facilities need to be covered or just only the ones that have a mix of sand and salt. And the final fiscal impact to the state that's identified in the memo is that there is a potential revenue raising mechanism within the bill as drafted to collect certification fees from commercial applicators. The bill as currently drafted contains no specific fee schedule, but does direct the governor to propose a fee, which will be paid by commercial applicators. Depending on the amount of that fee and the number of commercial applicators that the state has in any given year, kind of establishes the range of potential revenue raised by this bill. And that would again largely depend on the amount of the fee that's eventually proposed by the governor. I will note, and this is noted in the memo, that New Hampshire's fluoride reduction program is entirely funded by the participant certification fees that it collects. And I believe in testimony to this committee, staff from that New Hampshire program noted that they currently have 1 part-time coordinator for that program that's supported by those certification fees. And they did also note that implementation and kind of full realization of their program as currently outlined in statute would benefit from 1 to 2 full-time positions. So those are the direct state fiscal impacts that JFO has identified from the bill. And in the final section of the memo here, we kind of outline some of the indirect fiscal impacts, both to the state and to actors outside of the state that the committee may hear further testimony on or may consider further. So for example, if this program were successfully implemented, it has the potential to eliminate or prevent new chloride impairments in waters of the state, which has the potential to represent a significant cost savings. For example, when a water body of the state is impaired under a regulated pollutant, it's required under the Clean Water Act to remediate and restore those waters, and to the extent that those impairments are avoided, that represents a cost savings to the state or avoided costs to the state. There are also private actors who are affected by chloride impairments in ground or surface waters. For example, drilling a new well is something that can sometimes be required if a private entity's drinking water well is contaminated by chloride in groundwater. And so to the extent that those impairments are avoided, this program could also produce cost savings for private actors, as well as potential municipal savings on the amount of salt purchase. Again, JFO isn't in a position to provide detailed commentary and analysis on the potential extent of those savings, since they would be so variable across private and municipal actors across the state. But those are considerations that are relevant to the bill. Under the second bullet, we outline some of the variables involved in determining the extent of fiscal impacts on municipal and private actors. The amount of salt savings would really depend on things like variation in winter conditions, how severe or how mild is your winter, and how much salt is applied in any given year. That affects any avoided costs that municipalities might receive from having to avoid purchasing salt. Additionally, municipalities vary widely in the amount of road mileage they have, depending on size, rural nature, suburban or urban nature, as well as the number of paved versus dirt roads, right? Salt application is very different on paved surfaces than it is for de-icing practices on paved roads. And finally, the extent to which certification alters the purchasing behavior of municipalities is another variability that would impact, or another variable that would impact the extent of possible municipal savings. Many municipalities maintain a certain kind of baseload of available salt stockpiles, regardless of weather conditions. And so the extent to which that purchasing behavior is changed might be seen several years out, right? As municipalities kind of go through those stockpiles that they normally maintain, and the extent to which they can avoid purchasing salt several years after they begin implementing these practices. And then finally, the municipal and private cost savings from reduced salt application would be, as I mentioned earlier, partially offset by participant costs associated with the bill's compliance, reporting, and record keeping requirements. There is a requirement, for example, in the bill that certified applicators, be they municipal or commercial, have to maintain certain records for 5 years is the current requirement as well as
We're
drafted.
gonna check the statute of limitations.
Yeah. And those costs, might be small, it's simply keeping something on file, but they do represent, a slight qualifier on potential cost savings, right? To the extent that the bill imposes additional record keeping and other requirements on participants of the program, they might raise some of the potential cost savings to participants. And then finally, same note as above with state-owned salt and sand storage facilities, to the extent that municipal or privately owned actors who are participating in the program also have to incur costs to cover uncovered facilities, that would represent an additional fiscal impact. That's the conclusion of the memo. Happy to take any additional questions on memo, fiscal considerations, the other points that committee members might like to raise. Sure.
Go ahead.
So in summary, how much is it gonna cost? I mean, we picked $250,000, but we really don't know based on the other stuff that we don't have data, like, how many municipalities have salt sheds, but how many were actually covered. I think most of them are, but, so kind of, we don't really know how much it's gonna cost.
In order to speak, because you play something dollar, we should remember about. We're not requiring municipalities cover, require only state, was that correct?
Can you say that again?
State, are we requiring this bill that municipalities cover sheds or just state cover sheds?
To go back.
I mean, cover salt. With sheds,
I don't remember. We can go back and talk about
so it doesn't matter.
it.
Which one, which is it?
But do you have any further thoughts on Senator Williams' question? Okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, you look at me.
Well, because I saw you had your own.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think. Until we finish working on the bill, the JFO is not gonna be able to do a full fiscal estimate because. I think that we should change the part of the bill, for example, where we just set aside $250,000 for a private contractor, because first of all, that's just like showing our hand and being like, hey, we're gonna pay you $250.
Right.
$250,000 to do whatever. And I think that's a lot, and that's why I think looking at other options, like we were talking this morning with AOT, is a good idea. But I also think that they can't run the program without staff, like, so they're gonna have somebody. And the fees are gonna have to put part of the bill.
What I got from the state was, depends on the winter, but, if we may save money because we don't use as much salt, but. Some years we use a lot more than others, so it's kind of hard to put a price, I get it.
Well, even with variable winters, it'd be hard to know how much would you have used in addition, but for good practice.
Sure.
Yeah.
In looking into the experience of other states and programs, many of which have testified before this committee, I think there are a lot of anecdotal reports of reductions in salt application and associated costs. But it is difficult because of the variability you described, Senator, it's difficult to know exactly how much would be saved one year to the next. I do think the input from the agencies would continue to be very valuable in scoping out the potential cost of the contracting piece, as well as perhaps additional conversation with New Hampshire program and other analogous programs, and looking into this a little bit. I had gone back into some of the New Hampshire governor's expenditure reports from previous years to see how much they were spending on their program, their salt reduction program. And I would want to check further with the staff to make sure that I'm understanding their budget reports correctly, but it appeared that the expenditures for the program ranged from 50,000 to around 130,000 per year, if I'm understanding the New Hampshire governor's expenditure reports from previous years correctly.
Thank you.
That sounds like a fun project.
But it's
It's serious.
Yeah. Additional consultation, but you're after. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Did it appear that if you looked at the expenditure side, did it also appear that they had enough, the income was generated from fees to cover that 130 or whatever it was?
It appeared to be exactly 1-to-1.
Okay,
Yeah, that their program costs were essentially fully covered by their certification fees for one. And I think that that might be because their certification fees are essentially cap on expenditures for the program because they're sole source of funds. I would again defer to the New Hampshire folks on the details of that, but that's how it appeared from Senator Bolts that reviewed.
Okay, fair enough. Any other questions? Thank you so much. We know that this will continue to evolve.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Okay, so we are scheduled to have legislative council with us starting at 11:30, and we have a little bit more than 10 minutes, so I think, yeah, we'll just take a break until 11:30. We'll start up then. Thank you. much interesting stuff. Okay, all right, so it is still February 11th and said Natural Resources and Energy, and we are jumping into going through the chloride bill. And so thank you so much for the new draft. Appreciate that. And it seems to me, well, so since you're here, I think I would propose that we start from where we left off and keep going.
Okay.
How does that sound to you all? I was mostly just thinking about backtracking. We didn't have Mike Woodley here, but since we do, I feel like we should keep moving forward. Does that sound okay? And then
We're on draft one.
So what you were marking up was the bills introduced. Do you want to stay with that, or do you want
Okay.
to work based off of the amendment?
did you make, I didn't have a chance to look through the changes, very much so. Did you change anything beyond, because we stopped, I believe, on page 7 of the as introduced, or it's section 1354. Other changes beyond that?
No,
Okay.
the-
So it shouldn't, as long as we're all starting from section 1354, we should be looking at the same language.
well, there is some changes in 1354 now that I look at it.
Okay,
And it was from the editors, not something that you had requested, just
Okay.
clarification.
well then perhaps we can keep, well, perhaps let's work off of the draft 1.2
Okay,
that has some drafting changes.
sure.
And so for our purposes, that's page 8, so we would start just at the top of page 8. Does this make sense to everyone?
Mhm.
Okay, I'm gonna be kind of going through both simultaneously, because all my notes are on the as introduced version. Do you want to share slides or screens or anything?
If
If
you want
not,
me to, I can.
do you have opinions about that, team? I don't particularly have it on paper. I don't need to have it. Okay,
All right.
great. Okay, so starting at the top of page 8, draft 1.2.
So you're in the section on storage and disposal of salt. This is the requirement, that, all salt storage facilities be mapped. And the type of the materials stored at them be identified. And then A&R come up with best management practices for all city, town, and privately owned salt storage. And that ultimately require that all state, municipal, and privately owned salt and sand storage facilities within 100 yards of surface or drinking water be undercover on or before 2030, be funded before 2035. And it previously said by 2030 or by 2035, and the editors hate that thing.
On or before.
And then they also wanted to separate out the requirement for the funds be available to facilities subject to cover requirements. Last week, I also talked to you about whether or not there's the federal multi-sector. It's the multi-sector general permit for industrial stormwater discharges. Salt sheds do have requirements underneath that permit, so there are supposed to be stormwater requirements implemented for salt storage facilities. I believe the state is meeting all of those.
We are.
And I don't know what municipal compliance is.
Sorry, municipal compliance with,
The multi-sector general permit for stormwater management around salt storage facilities.
okay. One of the notes that I have to myself here about this section is, what happens if there is a failure to either report or, failure to do this, particularly for the, municipally or the privately owned salt sheds. And do we need to define a penalty?
No.
Okay.
And that's because A&R's chapters are all we'll just step back, there's about 35 chapters in Title 10 that are all enforceable by A&R. Instead of repeating the enforcement authority in each of the 35 chapters, we put it all into one, and then you list the applicability of that chapter to the other chapters in Title 10. One of the chapters that is listed is chapter 47, which is the water resources chapter. This program is being added as a subchapter to chapter 47. So all of the enforcement authority that the agency has for a water resources program would apply. So failure to comply with any of these requirements is something that A&R already has the enforcement authority for.
Okay, that covers it. Thank you.
And I do want to note, if somebody gets into the weeds and looks at what that enforcement authority is. So the maximum violation per incident is $17,000. It's $42,000 per day, and it's $170,000 total. And those are all numbers that are targeted to the federal delegated programs. So you need those numbers in order to continue to be federally delegated for Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. So that's why it's that number. It never reaches that number for most violations, but it has to be there in order to comply with federal requirements. So if somebody comes to you and says, oh my God, we're a municipal salt shed, we can't pay $107,000. You're not going to be paying $107,000.
And why would you never get there?
Because the agency honestly would never look for that kind of a penalty for that situation. And also when the numbers get that high, the Attorney General gets really interested. And the Attorney General has a kind of dual enforcement authority over A&R's programs, and will probably take on that program with that enforcement action with that. Anything over 170, the AG already takes. Things under 170 that are sexy, the AG also takes.
No, that makes sense. Okay. Great. Any other questions about this? Sorry, go ahead.
Sheds
Yeah.
are not sexy.
Now that we're talking about it. Yeah.
Chair Watson, if it's appropriate, I'd like to ask maybe a question about the refer to V-Trans on line 1, 2, and 3 on this section.
Yeah, go ahead.
So since we're regulated under the section to comply with what's under that section, but is it appropriate to have us consulting A&R on establishing the requirements? Seems like we may want to strike or refer to AOT, but I'll leave it up to your discretion.
And if I am understanding it you correctly, you are going to be part of the group that is held accountable.
Correct.
So you should also not be
We should
regulating.
be setting standard for compliance.
Wow, I'm so impressed.
Right? Why?
Yes, thank you. So good. So I know you're asking it as a question, but I'm going to turn it into a suggestion that we do strike.
Yeah.
The consulting with Secretary of Transportation on lines 2 and 3.
And not to go backwards, but the same occurrence happens on page 5. We're fine with consultation on establishing the program. That's on page 1, I believe, but page 5 is the same consultation where there are set of requirements AOT is required to comply with.
Question, yes,
Of course, but it actually makes sense for us to talk to the agency before they do it. It's like, is this reasonable? Why not? What? And we're not for the statute. I assume they'll do it anyway, but
yes.
but it would also be,
Well,
that's not, it would be smart to do that.
yeah, well, let's flag that on page 5, line 3 and 4, because we're gonna come back to that anyway.
Thank you.
And we'll get into more detail about that when we're going once back through the whole thing again. Okay, thank you for that, that's great. I think we're good to keep going, and I just want to also note that I'm glad to see that we've got this new, section 4 on page 8. I guess it's for subdivision 4, I'm not sure what it is. Subdivision 4, because it replaces this line, facilities will be eligible for grant funding and
Right.
privately owned salt folks would not be eligible for, state grants.
Right, and you honestly, that language, you needed to identify where the funds are coming from. So this will identify the funds that may be used for any of the facilities subject to the government requirements. And the agency does issue grants for private, at times. So there is opportunity. Sometimes the grant conditions are so they are what they are, that it's easier for a private entity to get private finance.
Right. Okay, let's keep going into section 2.
This is conforming change effectively. This is a requirement in chapter 47 of water resources. Chapter about classification of waters on page 9. You'll see that the citation to what really was the Clean Water Act amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, that's being struck, and the current US code citation is replacing that. And then on page 10, as part of the directive for when the agency is managing waters and classifying waters to determine if there are pollutants or impairments. This is the whole discussion about where you monitor the water for the pollutant. Generally, the agency will monitor further from where the pollutant is coming into the water from the point source to allow for what's called mixing, because they want to look at the water quality as it exists kind of generally, not just where, you can think where the pollutant is coming in, that there's going to be higher levels there. But that is exactly the point where some of the advocates want to monitor right there, because they believe that the mixing zone is too far away and it doesn't adequately assess the damage that's being done in proximity to where the pollutant is being added to the water from the pollutant source. This is some kind of policy/science policy argument. I don't have a great recommendation for you. I see both sides. It does change how a water might be classified or determined to be impaired, because there is opportunity for mixing, for dilution further away from the point source, and it may never be determined to be impaired water or strict designated uses. Because it's never, I mean, it's to me, this is something that it's beyond my scientific knowledge, and you're the policymakers.
Yeah, I feel like I heard that there are perhaps different reasons why you might want to measure further away versus at the point source. So yes, but
I was gonna say, can we just ask them to do both, or is that overly burdensome? That when they're assessing, they do at the point of discharge and in the mixing zone, or whatever the official term is?
See, I think that might create conflict, because they're supposed to go out and measure and assess whether or not a water is impaired. So is the water impaired because you monitored close, or is it not impaired because you monitor further away? And what happens when they're not consistent with each other? And so there would have to be
A
some
definition of
directive.
what's
Right.
impaired.
That's something to do with the TMDL for But we haven't.
It has to do with the water quality assessment that the agencies have to do, which can lead to the TMDL. But every 3 years, the state has to go out and determine whether or not all of the waters or water segments meet the water quality standards. And when they do that, they do monitoring, they do assessment. They also have a network of people that just do monitoring voluntarily for them to stay like be involved. And so where you do the monitoring may affect whether or not the water is going to be determined to be affected or not, impaired or not.
This one, I feel like there's a little bit of ambiguity here, so.
I wonder if we could. Yeah, a little bit more testimony on the agency to sort of suss this out a little bit.
This one feeling. Yes, good.
So we really need to establish a benchmark so we can see if we're making progress towards attaining goals. And, you know, if you listen to the previous testimony, the salt chloride is already in the ground in places over the years, it's accumulated. You know, can we ever improve based on that? You know, obviously, the more rain we have, more gets washed into the stream. I just want to make sure we can get credit for, we set goals, we can get credit for attaining these.
Well, I don't know if you heard from any of the municipalities where there is an impaired chloride water. Did you hear from any of them? And about what they're gonna have to do? They're gonna have to do salt management, right? And it's pretty similar to what, at least in my understanding, is pretty similar to what would be required here. And so if you do this now, you prevent the water, hopefully, this is the whole policy argument, you prevent the water from becoming impaired again. Is there salt in the soil? Yes. Is it gonna run off? Yes. Hopefully, if you do this, and you don't do anything about the soil, the water stay unimpaired. But I can't say that this is the gonna fix that.
First step.
Yeah,
But, you know, phosphorus is in the soil. Phosphorus has been here for decades. The feds used to truck super P up here in trains and just like, give it away for free. And that's what we're doing.
I've actually known that, because I used to be working on farms when I was a kid. And I think it was the soil conservation department used to bring it up and give it to the farmers. And they're like, what are we gonna do with this stuff? They used to put it on the manure spreader.
Yeah.
Buy a bag and take it out and spread it for your soil.
But there are management
Yeah.
techniques for that runoff of that. But that's what the state has been dealing with for the last 25 years.
But my understanding of the difference between phosphorus and chloride, what I think I've learned is that there are ways to get rid of phosphorus, but what you can't really get rid of chloride or sodium chloride, once it's in the water, it's sort of there.
Right, so phosphorus doesn't dissolve like chloride dissolves, like chloride dissolves in the water. And
I thought it was the opposite. That. No.
so phosphorus will sink.
It's bonding, doesn't
Right,
bond,
right,
that's it, okay,
it dissolves.
dissolves, doesn't bond.
So that's,
Like you can do reverse osmosis, as you guys have talked about, but that's expensive and hard. Okay.
Yeah, in corn seed. So, okay, flagging this one, see if we can get a little bit more testimony on that, that's gonna be good. Let's keep going.
One more question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So do we know which municipalities have already been notified that they have impaired waters?
for fluoride, I think it's Colchester and South Burlington and maybe Burlington. Depending on where and the water segment that's impaired is. Okay, there's it could just be in South Burlington. But the last time I looked, it was I can't even remember the name of the brook in Colchester, it's that small of a brook. So some side, and then I think Centennial.
Yeah.
And there's one other that you name this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on to section 3.
So section 3 is basically a report from the agency and its implementation. ANR shall adopt the BMPs by procedure or by rulemaking. Most likely they'll do it by procedure if procedure is less expensive. The secretary shall adopt any procedure or rule on a report November 1, 2026 for initial use January 1, 2027. And then as part of the fee report, the governor shall recommend the fee for certification of commercial applicators. I think when has James talked to you?
Yes.
Did he raise a concern about the fee report or if it's on cycle or
He did not,
He did
I
not.
was just about to do that.
Yeah, just go ahead, yeah.
The fee report hasn't happened. I don't think at all ever since I've been here. Maybe once.
it happens, but not in the way that it used to happen. Now what you get is the agencies that it's their turn. What the administration submits is just a list of their fees and how much they generate. It doesn't actually recommend anything.
Right.
Mhm.
And Senator Beck, you probably remember those from Ways and Means. It's not the old report that Auto Traps used to do where they would literally bring a bill with all of the fee. It's
Right.
not the same.
So I don't think this mechanism works.
I agree. I was told that for the fee cycle that if for whatever iteration, they do now, ANR is not up. For their report. So one, different possibilities, we have a date certain. That we just put this in, but maybe I'm jumping in here too soon. I'm cutting you off, Ruth. Go ahead.
I don't, no, you're not necessarily, I mean, but I just think the two options are either we ask ANR to report when they do this report. To recommend a fee that would cover the program. And or we just put a fee in and say this is what it's gonna be, and the ANR can tell us whether they need more or less or something. Because this, yeah, won't work.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So which would you like? Do you want to put the fee in yourself or do you want ANR to come back? They could come back January of 2026 with the recommended fee.
Yeah, that sounds good. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. Great.
Then section 4. It's when a state water segment is identified as contaminated by fluoride that exceeds the US EPA chronic food standards. ANR shall begin regular monitoring of fluoride levels and investigate potential issues with diffuse contamination sources. If the source that is causing the contamination exceeds, the secretary shall require monitoring for physical discharge into the water or into a hydrological connection to the water. So you're back at where does the monitoring occur?
Go ahead.
Do we know if ANR is already doing that?
They do monitoring.
Or
But I think the question is if when they do that monitoring, if they do it at the point source. You're back to that question that you've already flagged for discussion with the agencies.
Yep, so when we have them back in to talk about that question particularly, it'll be in reference to this section as well.
And then there's the appropriation section, and there's 250,000 from the general fund to A&R for a third-party vendor. Full disclosure, this will take the bill to appropriations. They will do with it what they will. So,
I think I know someone. And then this number is kind of a question mark too. Senator, you had some thoughts about some alternatives. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically we should not say that it is for the third party vendor. We should say that it is for support of the program or something like more generic. And I mean, we got testimony from New Hampshire that you need a position or at least a part-time position to run this program. So if this money is available, which I mean, I guess we're not gonna get a quarter from $1 million for this program, but if whatever we can get to have a position to start implementing it before and to designing it before they start collecting fees in particular, because there's not gonna be any money.
Yeah. So have the positions start potentially ahead of the implementation?
Yeah, I mean, I need somebody to create the program. It sounds like, and what we want it up and running by 2027, is that right?
well, basically, you need the standards by 2026 for implementation in 2027.
Yeah, so you need somebody to create the standards and work with potential vendors and work with the AOT if they're gonna do part of it and do all the outreach and.
Yeah.
So maybe we do in the first year, this money for the position, because they're not gonna contract with the vendor the first year.
Right. And then hopefully fees will be able to either pay for or offset that position moving on into brighter and running.
And help pay for the program, yeah. So if position is more like 125.
125, yeah. And that's in 2026, and so you're not going to appropriate anything for the vendor as for.
Right, right. Yes.
So I'm thinking out of the box here, thinking that this is gonna trigger another. List like the impervious surface, the 3-acre impervious surface. That, you know, say find out what's impaired, we're gonna end up with more, probably municipalities. That are gonna have to be put on a list of, it's gonna cost them more money. So, safe assumption.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that the JFO brought up, that if we, as a first step, that it could potentially help us avoid new TMDLs for salts. Because that is also very expensive.
I mean, that is definitely one of the things that the purposes of this bill is to try to keep as much salt out of the water, so fewer waters are impaired, and you kind of town doesn't assume that liability, or like AOT doesn't have to assume that liability for its facilities. They've already done it. They've already seen the fact that it is something that is valuable to both the environment and to their avoidance of liability.
And do their budget, it's just use less salt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any
Cover
other-
your salt shells, just for now, for movement.
Just sensitive to the time here, team. Any thoughts about restructuring the finances for this?
We don't know, what we don't know, right? It doesn't hurt to find out what the fee would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we just cut the cost in half, Terry, just so you notice.
Fair enough. Okay, okay, well, I think that is pretty much it, unless section B or, subdivision B or section 6, there's nothing really to talk about there.
No, the effective date, most of the dates for implementation are built
I knew
into
you
the
knew it was there, sure.
Say that.
it's built into the substance of the bill,
Yep.
you know, the deadline for the report, when the program is implemented.
Okay.
You can make it in fact, why it passage is it gets the agency a little bit more time to start to ramp up the program, but it's. And even, and I've been told that this session is gonna run long, so
No.
passage dates are probably kind of irrelevant in a long session.
Okay, well, it's
Aspire. Everybody.
You take like a 2-month break and then come back.
there.
We've done that before.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're done. Thank you so much. Philip, we're